A few days ago, the lovely Evelyn Clark from the amazing You Have My Interest Wealth podcast interviewed me to ask me how I got into property. And we discussed the best areas around Australia to buy versus not, capital city versus capital city, an update on each of those locations. We discussed how I got into real estate and how I made and why I made the switch from shares to property, pros and cons. We talked about leverage. We talked about the importance of cash flow and yield. This was really a discussion that will benefit both beginning investors and also quite experienced investors. You know, there's a saying that strength doesn't come from doing the things you can do, but it comes from overcoming the things that you once thought you couldn't. And I think if you stick around till the end, this episode will give you a lot of strength to overcome your own obstacles in wealth creation. Let me know what you think. Here we go. Welcome to the Oz Property Investment Mastery Podcast. My name's PK and I help busy people build passive income by buying top 5% growth and cash flow property and build a portfolio using data without wasting months doing research, spending weekends at inspection or catching flights, or dropping $10,000 to $20,000 on buyer's agents every single time. So if you're confused, lack confidence, and just overwhelmed with all the information and marketing misinformation available online and don't know where to start, then this show is for you.
Welcome, PK. So great to have you today on the podcast.
Thanks, Evelyn. Good to be here.
Really looking forward to hearing a little bit about your story today and also the wealth of knowledge that you have for a lot of people out there that are either looking to get into investing in property or potentially are already property investors themselves. So I thought we'd just start off a little bit by going through your story. Why did you get into property, specifically investments, and what is it that, makes you so excited about this topic?
Okay. I don't sort of have like a 1 minute elevator pitch or anything ready, but like essentially I'm like everyone. I graduated university and I was quite like academic, like I was really into studying and things like that. And I became an investment banker, which was kind of my dream for probably like 5 or 10 years, all through kind of end of primary school, start of high school. So I really worked hard to get there. But when I did become an investment banker, which was like really fun and a high paying position as a 21-year-old, I found that actually although I enjoyed it, it was just so hard. Like I was working 90 hours a week. And then I looked at my boss and then my boss's boss, my boss's boss's boss. They were making like much, much, much more money, of course, than me. I think 2 rungs up, they were on like 7 figures, but they were literally working even harder than I was. So I was thinking, like, I've worked so hard throughout university to get to where I am, but this is not really the life I want. I do want the money, if I can say so. Like I do want that abundance of resource, so I don't have to make choices in life. That was just kind of like my mindset at the time. But I don't want to have to work this hard. So that was, I don't know if I was being lazy, but that was my mindset. So then all of a sudden I knew everything about the stock market as an investment banker does. And I was like, I still can't figure out how to build like a retirable passive income, so that maybe in 10 years time, if I'm audacious enough to say, by the time I'm 31, I can stop working and just retire. And maybe I was just overambitious, but I was like, stock market, I can't do this because there's lack of leverage. It's too risky. It's just too much stress for me, even though I was on the inside. And so then I got into property because everyone invests in property in Australia. And I went to all the seminars and things like that. And it didn't really rub me the right way. It seemed a bit scammy. But nonetheless, I did a lot of work myself and got into real estate. And I'm really passionate about it because, at least for me, it did really well. I mean, I'm sure I made tons of mistakes, as everyone does. But for me, I'm really passionate about it because it actually did allow me to leave my 9 to 5.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned a really key word there that I just want to touch on a bit more, and that's leverage. And you mentioned that, the stock market in particular had a lack of leverage. So for those that potentially don't really understand the difference in investing in shares versus investing in property and how you can make that leverage work for you. Can you touch on a little bit about that and how maybe it helps you kind of, really project that wealth creation quicker?
Yeah, sure. I mean, essentially, it's quite basic. Like, let's say you got $50,000, and I think when you are young, potentially, you see online, and perhaps your family and friends, they invest in stocks, and maybe they had a great year and it goes up 20%, and everyone's like high five each other. Fair enough, right? So 50,000 to start with, it goes up, let's say 10% or 20%, that's five or $10,000, which is, that's good. But
Mm,
if you take that same $50,000 and you apply leverage on it, leverage meaning you get a loan from the bank can probably lend you, I'm just making this up, round numbers, $300,000. Okay, if you've got an adequate income and things like that. And so then you can add your $50,000 to that 300K loan, and you can go out and buy a property for $350,000. And let's say that increases, let's just say 10%, just to be conservative, after even just 1 or 2 years. Then 10% on $350,000 is $35,000. So
mm,
the stock market went up by 10%, gave you $5,000 return on $50,000. The property market went up 10%, you got $35,000 return on your same initial $50,000. So obviously 35 is 30,000 more than just 5,000. You started
yeah.
with the same, but cash on cash return is higher in the real estate market. And of course, you can leverage or you can gear up in the stock market as well, but no bank is going to consistently allow you to take out 80% loans, or only require 20% deposit. It's more like 50% loans
Yeah.
that they give you, whereas in the real estate market they give you, I mean, these days even up to 95% in some instances, but to be safe, around 80 to 88%. And so for me, looking back on it, was like, it was just a no-brainer.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great example you've given there. And it's something that, we see time and time again where for probably more those people that are buying or trying to buy multiple investment properties, the element of leverage is something that can be a really useful tool for them to be able to not just acquire the first, but then acquire the second and third as that property starts to increase in value.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, you're a mortgage broker, you're in this space all the time. You know much better than I do that good debt is your friend. There's bad debt, like credit card debt, and I don't know, getting a loan for a car and
Mm,
stuff like that, or a overseas holiday. But then there's good debt, which actually allows you to invest, and that investment compounds. And I think
yeah.
perhaps in our education system, this difference isn't well articulated. And so everyone thinks every type of debt is bad. But I have a strong belief that in order to be debt free, have your own home and in some years in the future be debt free or mortgage free, it's imperative to actually start with good debt. You need
Mm,
good debt to be debt free, as counterintuitive as that sounds.
yeah, yeah, no, I like that. And so how did your property journey sort of start out? You mentioned you made a few mistakes. I'm sure we all have. What were some of those mistakes? What were some of your first learnings?
Yeah, so I think I was quite perhaps lucky. I did do a lot of work, but in terms of understanding all the data that was available in the Australian market and building my own sort of, you could say, models or relationship curves between various factors and what actually drives growth in
Mm,
particular suburbs. But I think my third property, I think it was in 2015, that I got in Cairns, that was like a huge mistake, because back then, and I wasn't super experienced. So back then there was this talk of, okay, the Australian dollar is falling, therefore it makes traveling to Australia much more affordable for overseas people. Like, that logic is sound. And Cairns is a tourist economy, or at least it was back then. Now it's more diversified.
Mm.
And so I was thinking, well, that is going to mean a whole lot new people come into Cairns. Therefore, like lighting a fire under its economy. They were expanding their airport. There was this talk of some like Hong Kong billionaire building a casino, and it was going to be like a star casino, or like some, huge sort of complex that they were going to spend billions on that would completely make. They were saying Kansas is going to be like Las Vegas, right?
Right.
And as someone who, in hindsight, was very naive, I kind of bought into a lot of that, and I was like, "Oh God, I can get something in Cairns for 400K that pays for itself. Like this is going to become $1 million in like 5 years' time, or something
Yeah.
like that." And so right now, that property really didn't do anything except for the last 1 or 2 or 3 years. Now it's probably like 550, 600. But for the
Mm.
first 5 years, it was just flat because despite the Australian dollar going down, it's not like tourists just go to Cairns. They go everywhere
Yeah.
in Australia. No one's just coming to Australia just to go to Cairns, right? And that Hong Kong billionaire went broke, or there was something that went on, and it didn't end up, of course, investing in
Mm.
Cairns. And so I think my biggest lesson from that is don't get swept away in the sort of headlines of the media, or the headlines of even property professionals. Perhaps even I'm guilty of like sensationalizing things. I think
Yeah.
everyone should take a step back and really internalize and understand. Does it feel right in your gut, and does it
Mm.
make sense in your head? Don't, especially if you're new, and I know a lot of your audience is new. Um, Evelyn, you can almost get FOMO, like, oh, everyone's made so much money already in the property market.
Mm.
I just need to get in, and then there'll be happy times. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And fortunately, my property didn't tank or anything, but there was a huge opportunity cost. That same
Yeah.
400K, if I had put it in, let's say, Geelong at that time, it would have more
Yeah.
than doubled.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, it's a great example. And we talk about that all the time in terms of not reading into headlines, not letting that dictate your state of mind even, and just making
Hmm.
sure that you are coming from a perspective of analyzing the data correctly, interpreting things correctly, making logical decisions, and not just jumping at something because someone said that. And uh, this is going a little bit off track, but something that I do like to talk about is when people are looking at buying their first property, not reading into or purchasing a property because they think they're going to get some sort of scheme or grant or concession from it, and
Yeah.
really looking at, why do I want to buy that property? What's it actually doing for me in terms of, is this actually a long-term investment strategy? And therefore, I need to buy the property based on that decision and not based on a government scheme or a concession, for example. So, one thing that you mentioned there was understanding the growth factors of a particular location, or what actually drives growth. So, can you touch on what should people be looking at, whether it be a particular suburb or location, or whether it be property data? What do you look at?
Yeah, sure. Um, this is going to be a little bit controversial, but it's all backed by data over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
I think what people naturally fall into the conclusion of is what intuitively makes sense. So, buy as close to the CBD as possible, buy close to water, whether it's a beach or lake or river, buy close to a train station, buy close to a shopping center, buy in areas where people are wealthy. All of these things make a ton of sense if you think about it for like 30 seconds. But then if you spend 30 minutes or 30 days analyzing it, you actually find that these things have no correlation whatsoever with capital growth.
Yep.
And I think people are only starting to realize that now because we have such a plethora of data. So we can actually take a topic like proximity to CBD and be like, okay, has a suburb, let's say in the Brisbane context, has a suburb like Red Hill,
Mm.
which is not too far from CBD, perform better than a suburb like, I'm just going to make this up, North Lakes, all right, which is quite far, or Petrie, which is, in the Moreton Bay Council, is quite far from the CBD.
Yeah.
And if you look at it over 30 years, you find that they've performed basically the same. If not,
Yeah. Okay.
sometimes further out, they've performed even better. And that's not just case of Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney. It doesn't make sense intuitively, but it actually is correct if you look at the
Mm,
data. So I think to talk about what you should look at, first of all, you need to like plow the field and get rid of all the stones and your existing predispositions and biases of what works. I think
mm,
we grow up and we need to kind of unlearn a lot of these things that perhaps our parents or society tells us.
yeah,
And so that's exactly what I did when I invested in real estate, especially my first property, because I didn't want to make a mistake. So what I found was there's actual statistical metrics, and I'll go through a few of them in a second, that have a clear correlation or clear causation with property market growth at the suburb level. Okay.
yeah,
So, for example, one of them is days on market. Days on market is just a fancy way of saying how long does it take from when a property is listed, like on real estate or domain, to when it's sold,
mm,
either when contracts are exchanged between the buyer and seller or when it's unconditional, i.e., the buyer has to go through and buy that property. Now, if that's like 90 days or 3 months, then that suggests that, look, properties are sitting around, there mustn't be that much demand, right? There
yeah,
mustn't be that much heat in the market. But when, like in Perth right now, the average days on market is 9 days. That
right,
includes all the crappy suburbs as well. So that suggests that it's such a hot market. Just properties are getting snapped up, and that suggests that property prices are going to rise. Now,
mm,
that is a demand side metric. Just because something is strong on the demand side doesn't mean prices automatically go up. You might find the supply is also through the roof, and so therefore those two cancel out each other.
right,
So a good supply side metric is stock on market, just like we had days on market, stock on market. Stock on market simply says that in a suburb, what percentage of houses are for sale.
mm,
So if you have, let's say, 100 houses in a suburb and five of them are for sale, then that's 5%. Now, we generally want that to be less than 1 or 1.5%. So you could have like a suburb that is taking 90 days to sell, that stays on market, and the stock on market is like 5%. That's a recipe for prices to go down. But if the
yeah,
opposite is true, then prices go up. So, of course, you can't just rely on two metrics, but if you look at many of these types of metrics, not to overwhelm anyone, but there's about 30, 35 metrics that you can kind of sink your teeth into, then
mm,
you can like, it's like the Mona Lisa, it's so nuanced. You can really paint a real nuanced picture of what a particular city, a particular LGA or local government area, or a particular suburb is doing, and therefore buy with confidence, knowing that, it's not just off a whim, but it's actually based on data.
yeah, fantastic. And is this what your course actually looks at? All of these different metrics and data?
Yeah, this is kind of the heart of what I teach, but I think
Yeah,
um, these what I've just mentioned is so even though it may not seem simple initially, you don't need to do the course to learn this. You can just like follow me on YouTube or something.
yeah,
Like you can do this yourself, honestly speaking, and that's what I'm all about. People can invest themselves. People can
mm,
DIY if they just um, if they just take an interest or have a bit of passion for it. You don't need to outsource your decision to a family member or a friend or some guru online. You can actually have conviction by learning these things yourself.
yeah, fantastic. Talking about the growth, we've talked a little bit about growth. Another topic that comes up a lot and maybe people get a little bit confused about is yield. So, can you talk about the differences between capital growth and yield? And when should you be worrying about one or the other, or should you keep an eye on both?
Right. Um, it's a great question. I feel that you've like just tossed up the ball, and I'm like a baseball player. I can just hit it out of the out of the park. But I once heard this analogy of that cash flow is the oil and capital growth is the engine. So if any
Okay.
nice car, you obviously want a good engine because you want it to go forward. But if you don't
Yeah.
have oil, then it's just going to put tutter out. It's just going to like fail after a little
Yeah.
while. So in property investing, yield is important because that is what gives us the cash flow. So regardless of whether the property goes up or down in value, if the yield is high, and yield, for those of you who don't know, is essentially just your annual rent. It might be like $20,000, $25,000, whatever it is, annual rent divided by the purchase price of the property. So generally in Australia, it kind of ranges from like 2% up to about 8% on average,
Hmm.
give or take. Um, so you want to get a higher yield. You want to, even, I firmly believe, even if you're a high net worth individual, you still want a yield of at least 5%. And if you're not a super high net worth individual, then perhaps 5.5%, 6%. Because what yield allows you to do is when you lose your job or a rainy day occurs or life throws you a lemon, then you never have to sell that property because it basically pays for itself. Okay, give or
Mm,
take, some properties you might need to chip in 2,000 a year, some properties might give you 2,000 a year. But in the long term, you never want to have to sell that property. Now, of course, yield alone is not going to make you a millionaire, even if you
yeah.
have like this terminology called positive cash flow property, which means that the property gives you more rent than all the expenses, including your mortgage, every year. A positive cash flow property in Australia might give you 1,000, 5,000, maybe maximum 7,000, 8,000 a year. A
Mm,
residential positive cash flow property. Now, that's fantastic, like, don't get me wrong, but once again, that's not life-changing, like, and I'm just generalizing here. For some people it might be, but another $5,000 a year is not, like, huge, right? So
yeah.
that's where the engine comes into it. That's why we need capital growth, because
Mm,
what capital growth allows us to do is hold that property, whether it's 300K property or 400K, 500K, whatever, and it makes it 300K goes up to 600K, 400K goes up to 800K after 7 years or 10 years or however long it takes, depending on how well you bought. And so that is actually what gets you out of the rat race, because what you can do in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years is if you have three, four, five properties, which you've been able to buy because they've all paid for themselves because of yield, then you
mm,
can sell a couple of them and use the profits to pay off the debt of the others. And so you're left with one or two or three properties that have no debt. And of course, if you bought with good yield, it's now not just giving you 5 or 6,000 a year, it's now giving you 25 or $26,000 a year
mm.
each. So that's kind of like a little bit complicated. I know that I kind of went off tangent a little bit, but yield is so important because you can't hold those properties, you can't hold that portfolio if each property is costing you 10, 20, $30,000 a year in holding costs. You just can't do it. And so what's the point of investing if you're just bought a property? Think of it like a business. Would you buy a business that's costing 10, 20,000, 30,000 a year? No, of course not.
No. Yeah. Yeah, awesome. That's fantastic. You might have thought you went off tangent, but I don't think so at all. I think you gave the information that needed to be given. So, yeah, thank you for that explanation. It's a really good analogy. Let's go around Australia a little bit. We were talking a little bit about this before we jumped into our podcast today. Um, you obviously know your data, you obviously study it. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of how the current states and capital cities are all performing?
Sure. I'll try my best. So, just quickly, let's start with Brisbane. So, maybe we'll just do capital cities in the interest of
Yep.
time. So, Brisbane, obviously, from 2010 to 20, it had the highest population growth of anywhere in Australia, yet property prices were basically flat. Once again, going back to what I said before, where things that you think matter, like population growth, don't actually matter as much as you think. So,
Mm,
what Brisbane then did from 2020 to 2022 is it went up like literally almost 50%. It kind of
yeah.
caught up all of that stagnation, that pressure build, and it went up so much. And then with interest rate rises occurring from 2020, the Brisbane property market corrected by about 8%. And then this year in 2020, since about March, it started to go up. So I think Brisbane's already recovered its correction. It's already
Yep.
back at sort of almost new record levels. And from this point onwards, it's interesting to see what will happen, is because demand is very strong on the Brisbane side. So anyone who's trying to buy a property, like, it's pretty hard in Brisbane right
Mm.
now. As we go into summer, more and more listings come on for sale. That's just a seasonal attribute of spring going into summer. And so it's to be seen whether the prices will continue to rise, because if a lot of listings come up, sure, there's demand, but the listings absorb all that demand. So I think Brisbane has got a lot of potential. We just want to wait and see, potentially 1 or 2 months, how the supply side pans out. But if the supply side doesn't actually absorb that demand, then I think 2024 could see, I mean, I don't want to like create FOMO or anything, or kind of hyperbolize anything, but we could see pretty significant price rises in Brisbane.
Yeah,
You know,
amazing.
saving, if interest rates go up again a number of times, then of course it may not happen. But
Yeah.
if interest rates only go up once or twice, then I think Brisbane's got a good year coming in
Mhm.
24. In terms of Sydney, that's been the best performing market out of any capital city in 2023, and that's in part because it was the worst performing city in 2022 because of
Yeah.
interest rate rises. They impacted Sydney more than other capital cities because in Sydney the affordability is the lowest. It
Mm.
takes on average more than 50% of your income just to service your mortgage in Sydney, which is like just ridiculous.
Mm.
So I think Sydney, once again, if interest rates don't rise again too much, then Sydney will continue to do well. But once again, the affordability story can't be ignored. So I think there's more upside than downside to Sydney, but it has to cap out in the next 1 or 2 years. It can't go on like this forever.
Yeah.
Melbourne is a very interesting one. It did decline because of interest rates, but not as much as Brisbane and Sydney in 2022. Leading up to the 2022 period, Melbourne didn't really experience as much of a COVID boom as other capital cities, and that's in part due to a fairly weak state economy. And of course, folks had a bigger and longer lockdown in Melbourne than in other places around Australia. And now coming out of the interest rate cycle where other cities are starting to rise in value, Melbourne is too, but at a sort of sluggish rate. And that is because the state government has basically penalized property owners in a big way down in Victoria with land tax increases and other ways in which property investors are sort of thinking, hey, it's just not worth it from a numbers perspective to invest in
Yeah.
Melbourne. So from that perspective, I don't think Melbourne will fall in value, but I don't think there's the best opportunity there over the short term. Adelaide has just had like a terrific period. You know, Adelaide grew more than Sydney. Adelaide grew more than basically any capital city between 2000 and 2010. All right. And then from 2010 to year 2020, Adelaide was like just dead flat. When I say flat,
Mm.
like 4% per annum, below the average nationally of about 7 to 8. And then since COVID, or actually starting in 2019, Adelaide started to go up and it's gone up more than 50%. It's kind of top heavy now. I mean, affordability is still stronger than Sydney, but in Adelaide, people don't like that kind of affordability. People in Sydney are kind of used to it. In Adelaide, they're not really.
Yeah.
So Adelaide is still chugging along. Interest rate rises have had little to no impact on both Adelaide and regional South Australia. But, you know, after a market grows by 50, 60, 70%, there's got to be a time where there's a slight correction, a breath, you know, of just stagnation or consolidation. That's
Yeah.
just how property markets work. So I think it's a bit too late to invest in Adelaide at the moment. Um,
Mhm.
Regional South Australia, there might be opportunities. Perth is a really interesting one. Not everyone, I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of people look down upon Perth because historically in the last decade it's been very volatile. It experienced two mining booms, and then it was a
Yeah.
huge decrease in value around 2013 to 2015, and then from that it's just been really stagnant. It started to rise in 2021, and right now Perth is the fastest growing capital city under $600,000. That's really interesting. And, you know, everyone thinks that Perth is a mining town. However, now it's more diversified. Uh, the property market is going up not because of investors. In fact, in Perth, there were 220,000 rental properties at the start of COVID. now, at not even at the start of COVID, 2 years before now, so around 2021, now there's 200,000 rental properties. So the investment or rental property pool has shrunk 10%. So what's driving Perth property prices right now is owner occupiers. And when
Interesting.
owner occupiers drive prices, that's a recipe for a boom, not a bubble. A bubble goes up, then bursts, comes down. When it occurs by owner occupiers, it's a sustainable boom. There's record migration. In fact, Perth has the highest population growth, both international and interstate, out of any capital city. I just said before that population growth doesn't matter
Mm,
for price growth, but if those people are actually buying to live,
yeah.
then that actually hits the demand side. So that's the kind of that's the kind of, I suppose, dynamic of Perth, and I think Perth people or Western Australian people had the second highest incomes in Australia, whereas property prices are one of the lowest of all capital cities. So there's a lot of latent affordability. So even if
Mm,
interest rates rise, people in Perth, I mean, generally speaking, are like, whatever, we can afford it, it's no problem. So from a Perth perspective, I'm very bullish on that for the next 1 or 2 or 3 years. And in fact, over the next decade, if we just
yeah.
zoom out, I think based on looking at the data, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Perth, if you sit here, we had this conversation in 2030, I think those three cities will have done the best. And just to round it off, I know I've missed a few places, apologies, but just to round it off, we talked about yield before. It's these three cities that have the best yield. So it's a kind of I suppose, I don't want to say golden opportunity. That seems a bit too hyperbole, but it's a good opportunity to buy in these three areas where you don't have to sacrifice yield like you
Mm.
do in Sydney and Melbourne, but you're going to get the best growth likely over the next decade.
Yeah, wow. I love that.
Sorry,
I
it's a
just want
lot,
you to keep
lot to
talking.
get out
I
there.
just want you to keep telling me information. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's probably like the reason I like listening to you talk is because you give the real raw numbers. You're not just sort of going off. You can tell you're not just going off assumptions. You have actually studied this data and you know how it's performed and where it's going. So thank you for that. I think even just that piece of content alone, our listeners are going to get so much value from. And from there, they can really take that away and go, okay, great. Well, if these are the areas that, we're looking at from historical data and potential future projections, now they can really drill down into suburbs and starting looking at those metrics in terms of how particular suburbs are going to perform or have performed, like you were talking about with those 30 to 35 key metrics earlier. So that's
Mhm.
amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important because I think once you're a property professional for a long time, you build up a set of assumptions in your mind based on your experiences, but it's really important for us professionals to always be really loyal and chase to the data. And if something we thought, like I thought was always right, but then the data contradicts it, I have to be like, just share the data because that's
Mm,
what helps make money, not my expertise, so to
mm.
speak.
Yeah, totally. Fantastic. Are there particular areas that you have your eye on at the moment personally?
So like personally, I'm actually almost under contract for a commercial property.
Oh, cool.
So it's the commercial market, which is obviously for those people who don't know is like retail, shops,
Mm,
things like warehouses for storage and also office space. I'm in the market for a warehouse, a commercial property, and we're looking at one in Brisbane right now. And the reason I'm looking at that is because leading up to the Olympics, I mean, everyone makes a big deal of the Olympics, but
yeah.
I think if you ask people, how many people actually watched even more than 2 hours of the last Olympic Games, I don't think many people can put their hand up. So I think I'm a little bit outspoken as to say that the Brisbane Olympic Games is not going to create such a big impact on
Mm,
Brisbane as some people think it will. Olympic Games in the past were magnificent, pompous affairs, but in recent history and definitely going forward, the model has changed to be more like Olympics light, where they repurpose a lot of infrastructure. That you don't have to build like a million stadiums. You
mm,
just repurpose it. There's not that many people who attend the Olympic Games. The online views and audience has gone down. So the reason I'm saying all this is that I'm still very bullish on Brisbane. I think the Olympics are a good thing, but I don't think anyone should invest in residential real estate because the Olympics are happening in 10
Yeah.
years' time. But the reason I'm investing in, or hopefully investing in commercial property, it's actually quite close to the airport, is because there's just a lack of supply. There's almost like no decent warehouse space on key arterial roads leading to the airport. And for commercial warehouse or industrial property, you really need like trucks to easily be able to transport things to the airport,
Mm.
depending on the type of tenant you have. And with the Olympic Games coming, notwithstanding everything I just said, there's going to need a need for much more logistics and supply chain management from a lot of online retailers, etc., etc. So I'm quite bullish on commercial property around the airport precinct in
Mhm.
Brisbane. And so that's where I personally have my eye. But if I was investing in residential real estate, then like I said before, regional South Australia, um, Perth, a lot of parts of Perth actually,
Yeah.
and also regional Queensland, places like Toowoomba, places like Townsville,
Mm.
etc. I think they have a lot of a lot of runs on the board that we'll see that they've made in 2030 if looking back.
Yeah. Amazing. Are you already in commercial property yourself?
Yeah, I've got
Yeah.
a small, I would say, in number portfolio of commercial properties, which I only
Yeah.
really just started in the last 3 years.
Yeah, cool. I generally
Yeah.
tend to see that most people that are starting to invest in commercial properties usually have some sort of established residential portfolio.
Hmm.
Commercial properties are typically harder to get into from day one when you're looking at the comparison to a residential property for a variety of factors. One of those purely just being the leverage required, or the costs involved in getting into it from a upfront deposit perspective, for example. Um,
Hmm.
but I think commercial property, particularly in what we've seen, is starting to become, people are starting to open their eyes up a lot more to it now as well, which is great
Yeah.
to see. And what are some of the reasons that you're looking at commercial, or that you're starting to build out that side of your portfolio?
I think from for me and my wife, after you have a set amount of residential properties, which we're very blessed and grateful to have, you don't just want to go from like 12 to like 30. At least we don't, because like, let's be honest, it's a bit of a headache to manage 20 or
Yeah,
30 properties. I just don't want that. So for me, a key reason is to increase the price point at which I'm looking. So for my residential, I was always buying around 500K ish or less, because they grow just as much as more expensive properties but have higher yield, which we talked about.
yeah,
But if I have more resources to invest, then I don't want to go off and buy like 500K properties, because now I'm like just buying myself a full-time job. So that's why I'm going for commercial, because I can lump more funds in just one property, have a real quality asset, a real quality tenant with a
Mm,
long lease. And for me, just where we are in our investment journey, we just want to be as passive as possible. Like, we've done a lot of things like development and like really rolled up our sleeves, but maybe we're just getting old and lazy. We just want to like, just be as passive as possible. But to your point, more and more people are looking at commercial these days. I think in the last 3, 4, 5 years, it's become very much like more in season to consider
mm,
or buy commercial. But I think at the same time, not to be negative or anything, but just to be practical and realistic, in the last 5 years, we've probably had the best economy that Australia's ever had. I know that we
yeah,
went through COVID, but everyone knows how lucrative it was in the end for most
mm,
people. So we need to be careful that if and when unemployment goes back to normal levels, right now it's at abnormal levels, like under
mm,
4% is not normal. If it goes back up to 5, 6%, the economy goes um, a bit more soft, then it's a lot of these commercial properties, more so than residential, that are affected, because these small businesses, the tenants, they just will stop paying, and they will just
correct.
leave, and they'll have arrears. So I think, I think it's just important to, at least for me, this is how I think, and I try to be as conservative as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And that talks to the quality of the tenant and the importance of the tenant, I think, in commercial properties as well. You know, that there's so much value in that lease, not just the actual asset that you're buying,
Mhm.
but being able to secure someone that is going to have certainty of repaying, basically giving you a set yield or a set lease amount for a significant period of time. We see in commercial properties, for example, your leases may have options anywhere from like a 2 by 2 initial lease right through to a 15 to 25-year set term. So the difference in the lease terms for commercial and residential are drastically different. And the other part of it too is around the responsibilities of the tenant. So in residential, like you say, the more residential properties you own, the more of a headache it can be in terms of managing repairs, managing maintenance, the changeover of tenants, all of that sort of thing. Whereas in your commercial property space, the tenant typically will pay all outgoings, maybe minus land tax.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. I mean, most times they pay a lot of outgoing. Sometimes, like you said, they don't pay land tax or property management fees, and things like that. And I think, yeah, if you can, like you said, if you can land a terrific tenant that actually understands their business and their business is strong, not because I think one thing that I learned, Evelyn, was you can have a terrific lease, like a
Mm,
real rock solid lease, but if that tenant's business is experiencing, perhaps for the last 4 years, 3 years, a decline in profit margins or a decline in revenue, then even though they're obliged, as per the lease, to pay you, they can
mm,
just stop paying you. And I know it's a contract, but in my own experience, there's really not much you can do about it. You can take them to
mm,
court and you can go down that route. But let's say for the average investor who's buying a 500K to $1 million commercial property, and the tenant has 1 year left and they're due to give you, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000, and they're just going to stop giving it to you, then to go through court and everything costs like 20,000, 25,000 anyway.
yeah,
So I think not, I mean, that's kind of like a worst case scenario, but I think
yeah,
it's really important, as you said, to have a rock solid lease, but also before you buy a commercial property, understand their business and figure out, if you can, if that business is going to be around and strong for the next 5 or 10
yeah.
years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this kind of alludes to what we've seen happening in retail as well, where, retail as a general sort of principle has declined, particularly the like strip retail, where a lot of things have gone online. COVID was a big facilitator in that happening as well. So that's where selecting a commercial property, it's really important to understand the business that you're effectively going to be or is going to be leasing that property from you, and how their economy might be impacted as well.
Yeah, no, well
Yeah.
said. I think, yeah, commercial isn't necessarily harder than residential, I found. It's just different things to look at and different contingencies to
Mm,
be wary of. Like in the price point that I'm looking, I know that if the tenant leaves, then there will be a 1 year vacancy. And so I can get all over the moon and be like, celebrate a whatever it is, passive income, a six-figure passive income that's coming in from this one commercial property. But I need to
mm,
budget that every perhaps 3 years, every 5 years, every 7 years, there's going to be a whole year of vacancy. So I need to
yeah.
taper back my expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, a couple more questions I just wanted to finish off with. For anyone that is really looking to get their foot in the door in creating some sort of wealth for themselves through property, whether that be residential, whether that be commercial, what would you say are sort of first steps that you would encourage them to take? And I guess any tips that you have for that sort of real beginner investor?
Sure. Um, it's such a good question, and it's like different ways to answer it. But I think if I'm just putting myself in the shoes of a beginner investor, what I'm seeing is there are loads of people marketing properties and loads of people talking about the property market as authorities on podcasts, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, all sorts of places. And it's so easy to kind of go into a vortex of a particular provider and and just be sold on their charisma or their knowledge or their product or service. But I think it's really, really essential to, before you part with any money, whether it's by, through a buyer's agent or a course or this or that, it's really important to get a diverse um, array of sources of knowledge. And so you can then see, okay, this person is contradicting that person has got a different strategy to this person. Then you all of a sudden see, okay, the person I was following may not be right, or maybe they are right, but why is this person saying an opposite thing? And that will cause people to, a new person to think, because I think
Yeah.
there's a quote that, it's not my quote, I can't remember who said it. It's like 70% of the world's population um, don't think, 20% of the world's population think they think, and the 10% of the world's population actually think. So
Mm.
obviously we don't want to be in the 70%, but nor do we want to be in that 20% who are following this one or two people and they're thinking that they're doing research, but actually they're just following and just like lapping up
Right.
everything this one or two people are saying. So a diverse sense of content consumption is really important. And then before you do anything, you have to speak to someone like yourself, Evelyn, like a mortgage broker, and really understand like what it is that your financial capacity allows.
Mm.
Can I even buy a property, or can I not buy a property? What's my budget? And with a good accountant and with a good mortgage broker, these two people are really key to build a strategy. Like, okay, I'm new, I have this vision or dream to get a six-figure passive income, to use a cliche. What's actually possible for me? It may not actually be possible for you, or it may not be possible in the time frame that you think it is. So get these two professionals, and most of the time they will give you at least some advice for free. And if you vibe with them, then you can work with them more closely. And so that's probably the second step. And then the third step, coming back to your point around data, is before figuring out exactly where and what to buy, make sure you understand the data. Because I
Mm.
don't care if you're 1 year into the industry or you're 50 years into the industry, everyone is fallible and everyone can be wrong. And in fact, there are professionals that have been in the industry for decades, but what they say just blatantly contradicts just the cold hard data. So I think you can't honestly trust anyone with that decision making. You have to only trust yourself, and the way you trust yourself is by actually understanding the numbers, actually understanding
Mm.
the data. I always like to say that no one cares about your money as much as you do. And I will also say, including me. So, like, no one will take care of you if something goes wrong. No one will, they'll only congratulate you and give you a high five if something goes right. So,
Yeah.
protect your risk, protect your downside, protect your assets, protect your family, protect your financial future by becoming educated, whether that's through free sources, and you should start with free sources, maybe
Mm.
even end with free sources, but then also pay for it if you need to, because, price is what you pay and value is what you get.
Amazing. I think
Yeah.
that was just a fantastic way to summarize and give a really good sort of clear, clear and concise steps 1, 2, and 3 on where to start and how to start building that knowledge base. So I really appreciate this conversation today, PK. I've, kind of inspired me a little bit. So
I'm glad.
yeah, I really appreciate it. And I would love to let the listeners know where they can get some more information on yourself. So you've obviously got YouTube, you've got your course. Can you share a little bit about the content that you create and what you have on offer for people that might be interested in following you?
Yeah, sure. So just like your podcast, I have a podcast. It's called Oz Property Mastery with PK, and my YouTube channel, Australian Property Mastery with PK. And then I'm really quite passionate about my community on my Facebook group, which is, once again, Australian Property Mastery with PK. There's 40,000 like just amazing, amazing community members there. Many of them are like much more successful than me. And I think the power of community is when you join that group, it's free, and you ask questions, or even if you don't ask questions, what you get is like a real solid, and I try to moderate it in the sense that it's a data-driven debate on all
Mm.
things, whether it's strategy, where to buy, what to buy, how to negotiate, how to renovate, how to develop, like the whole gambit gamut of property information is there in real time, people doing it right now, not just based on someone who did it 20 years ago. And I think, the beauty of that is, at least this community, everyone is so willing to help each other. There are people who DM me like every single week who say, PK, I didn't do your course, but I bought this property and thank you so much for your community. Honestly, that makes me feel just as good as when a
Yeah.
client DMs me and says, I bought the property through your course, because the main thing is action. So I think
Mm.
join that community, or follow me on YouTube. And just like your podcast is inspiring people, Evelyn, I think the main thing is people take that knowledge and put it into action.